Welcome to the Album Anniversary Podcast. Today's show is about Sin by Poor Old Lou. Per the notes in some vinyl reissue that somebody told me about, it looks like this album was released October 30th, 1994, celebrating a 30-year anniversary. I could be wrong on that, but that's where we're going on. I'm your host, Caleb, or Caleb the Spy on Twitter and Instagram, and every day on those social media sites, I post about what I call album anniversaries. And look, it's just the anniversary of the album's release date. Sometimes I don't know the release date, like I did with this album that we're going to talk about today for quite a while, so I just randomly had picked a date on the calendar to kind of take that opportunity to celebrate this album. And that's really how this started. I started a calendar to celebrate the release date of some of my favorite albums. In the last year or so, the list of albums has grown significantly. I now have over 2,000 albums tracked on my calendar. And on this show, we often focus on those albums. And that focus ends up being a lot of alternative rock, punk, and my strange obsession with ska. In the 90s, I was super into the Christian music scene, so that comes up really often on the show. And I've always had a fascination with historically important albums or musical events. On today's show, we're joined by Brian to ask 5 simple questions about Sin by Poor Old Lou. Brian, welcome to the show. I'm glad you could join me to talk about this album.
Happy to be here. I've seen a lot of the stuff that you post on Twitter, and I've checked out a couple of the podcasts and the episodes. So, I love what you write about and your love for music and the way you get into it. So, I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really glad you could join me. I know you and I have been going back in a little about different albums. So the idea of covering a Poor Old Lou album was one of the things we wanted to cover. So, so speaking of that, like, what's your history with music? Is it raised in a house around music? Did you end up playing music as a kid, or is it something kind of discovered later in life?
I think it was a little bit of both. I mean, some of my memories growing up are my dad having a love for both the Oak Ridge Boys and Chicago.
Okay.
I remember bands like REO Speedwagon and Foreigner and Stevie Nicks being played in my mom's house growing up. Music was this thing that was just kind of there. It wasn't, constantly there. We weren't constantly listening to things. And I do remember a very brief failed attempt to take drum lessons when I was about 7. I think I did that I want to say maybe for about a month or so. I actually wish I had kept up on that. But the idea of getting up that early to go do lessons at my school before school time, I guess, just wasn't something that I was terribly interested in. But considering how much I love the air drum and how much I love to keep rhythm and do different things, kind of wish I'd kept up on it. And then as I've gotten older, it's just, it's one of those, I think probably not unlike most people. Get to high school, your friends are listening to it, you're listening to different things, you're exploring, you're discovering new bands, you're discovering what kind of music you like. And then it just goes from there. And as I got older, more music. And for a number of years, I was a freelance reviewer and critic for different, mostly for alternative papers, pretty much just all over the country. And so just exposing myself to all kinds of different artists. And so, I got this wide range of musical experiences.
I'm with you. My parents had me do guitar lessons, and I just was more interested in playing baseball because I thought I'm going to make it. And the guy who's 5'7", probably not going to make it to the big leagues. I should have stuck with the guitar.
Yeah, I had the same aspirations as a kid. 5'9", it's not getting the job done most of the time. Yeah, there are outliers.
That's one of those regrets. I'm not a big regret guy. I wish I would have stuck with the guitar probably, or even just learned the bass guitar, but 'tis what it is. So awesome. Well, I'm going to go through some fun facts. Brian's going to, we didn't have a ton of extra time, so Brian's going to jump back in a couple minutes. So Brian will be right back, and then we'll go through I'll go through some facts, and then we'll jump into this album, again, Sin by Poor Old Lou. So like I said, Brian, he had kind of a limited amount of time, so we decided to just focus our time on talking about the album, and I would do kind of some of these fun facts or the facts about the album by myself. So he'll be back in just a minute after I go through some of these. I like these just to set the table for what's to come or what the album is about. So, and this kind of feels like my old show where I would just sit around and talk to myself for an hour. I'm not going to talk for an hour about this album, but this is Sin by Poor Old Lou. And again, released October 30th, 1994. That's based on somebody kind of found some promotional material and said that they believed it came out October 30th, 1994. If that's wrong, I apologize. What are you going to do? It is what it is. So this was Poor Old Lou's third album. It is actually their fourth as a group. They had released like a demo tape, I think only, as a different name, and I can't remember what that name is, and I didn't write it down. So, but this was their third official album, the fourth as a group. But I think finding that first one is almost impossible. So Poor Old Lou's third album. It was released on Alarma, and we've talked about that before on the show. It was kind of a number of the other bands like Lost Dogs. I want to say Lost Dogs in the 77s. Adam Again, I think, were some of the bands that were on that record label. It was never as big as Tooth and Nail. I just don't feel like they ever had the impact that Tooth and Nail did. But, kind of in that vein of Tooth and Nail, 5 Minute Walk, and Alarma. Those are kind of the three that I often remember back in the 90s. I've heard Mind Size, and I think it's Mind Size. That's what I've written down. Now I'm doubting myself. I've heard Mind Size called their breakout album, but I really feel like this is the album that really is their breakthrough, their breakout that kind of puts them on the map for a lot of people. In fact, I feel like a lot of people really kind of resonate with this album as the album that was their introduction. It actually is going to come up later on the show that this was an introduction to Poor Old Lou for a lot of people. And I don't know if it's the standout cover that really drew people in, because I know that was both of us made mention of that. But this really is kind of I think their breakout. And I know Mind Size gets called that, but I would consider this their breakout album. This was produced by John, you know how good I am with last name, Goodmansons? I don't know. John, Goodmanson. I really can't pronounce anything. Poor Old Lou also is given producer credits on this. John Goodsman Mason, I'm good at English. John has got so many credits to his that he has produced, so many. I'm going to go through just a handful of them. Bikini Kill, Brandi Carlile, Death Cab for Cutie, Hanson, Harvey Danger, Hot Heat, Not a Surf, Sepultura, Simple Plan, Soundgarden, Sleater Kinney, I can never say their name right, Train, and then the Wu-Tang Clan. So he is a producer who has gone on to do some things and had done some things, I think, before this as well. But those are a lot of pretty big names, in my opinion, that he's gone on to produce or at least work with in some capacity. So pretty cool to have him connected to this album. And actually, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I look at some of those and I think, yeah, this guy clearly knows what he's doing and was able to put together some really cool stuff, in my opinion. The only other note that I have on this is I just think it is worth calling out that the hidden track on this, as far as I understand, is the Jeremy that gets referenced in the necklace thing that happens at the end. That is Jeremy Enigk of Sunny Day Real Estate. And I don't know if I say his name right. Engik. And, he has gone on to he's done a lot of solo work, and Sunny Day Real Estate, one of the, godfathers of emo, I think is what they're often referred to. But, they were childhood friends. And so kind of cool that Jeremy is on this album in that hidden track. So that's kind of cool as well. All right, those are our facts out of the way. We're going to bring Brian back and we're going to dive back into the rest of it, talking about this album. So let's jump in. Let's dive into these questions here. So what was your introduction to this album in particular?
So this is one of those moments where I'm actually kind of bummed that I don't have this aha moment of clarity. There are a few bands, a few specific moments where I know exactly where I was, what happened, the circumstances. All I know is junior year of high school, I'm 16, and I somehow discover Poor Old Lou. My my sense is that I would have been on one of my weekly many times a week visits to the local, Western Christian bookstore where I was hanging out in the alternative section. And it may very well have been me looking through, as I always do, and seeing the cover and wondering what on earth a pink peep was doing against this yellow background. But regardless, I what I can say, like the moment leading up to it, I don't know how I got to it, but once I got there and hearing the opening riff, the opening notes, and even the way Scott Hunter's lyrics start coming, vocals start coming in, I remember just thinking, wow, I didn't know Christian music would sound like this.
Yes.
Because up to this point, my experience has largely been, a steady dose of Michael W. Smith, a couple like, Cindy Morgan, maybe some of the more like pop kind of things. I'm only just sort of getting myself into it. I'm listening to Nirvana. I'm starting to get into Stone Temple Pilots and some of these other things, but like Christian music wise, if we can use that term, most of it's been more on the pop side. And then suddenly I start hearing this. And then my first thought listening to this is I didn't know Christian music could sound like this. This and hearing the beginning of Grandma Train's Lonely House. Mm-hmm. Those are two moments for me with respect to that thought process. I didn't know Christian music could sound like this.
Yeah.
And so almost from the get-go, I was hooked.
Yeah.
And that became one of my, they are still one of my all-time favorites, but like, forget about it.
Yeah. Yep.
They were like top of the list.
Yeah. I have this is the second answer in a row. Very, very similar, where I do not remember the specific moment, but I think we did the same thing. We would spend the weekly trip up to Northwest. It was Northwest Bookstore for us in our town. And I think they had listening stations for some things, but some things, I've said this before, we kind of had to pull them off the shelf. And sometimes there'd be three of us. And so we'd all choose something different. Like we'd all be like, all right, you get that one. I'll get this one. You get that one. And then if somebody found a winner, we'd all go back and buy it. But it was kind of the way we would do it. And I think one of us just pulled this off the shelf and said, oh my goodness, what have we found? Because I don't remember somebody talking about this or anything like that. It just was one of those things that all of a sudden it was around my friend group and we all were into it. I mean, I think that's kind of how it happened for me.
The only other little bit of context I can think of is the store that I went to. I think like a number of other Christian stores back in those days, whether it was at the store or in like the magazines and things, it would say, if you like secular band, you'll love random Christian alternative band that sounds nothing like these other ones, but it's the closest name we could find. So here you go.
Yes.
That's the only other thing I can think of. Like sometimes those things were on the level. Generally speaking, from my experience, they were not.
Yeah.
But that's the only other possible thing I can think of because I didn't know anybody else who was listening to them. And after I became obsessed with them, like nobody knew who they were, even out on the West Coast, which, since they were from the Northwest, and you were at least more likely to have heard of them. But
yeah. You made mention of it a little, that it sounded like nothing, like no other Christian music you had ever heard before. So let's dive into a little bit of that. Like, what is it about this that made it sound like that and really makes you love this album?
I think one thing in particular, like I alluded to, you have some of the more, it's not to say that Michael W. Smith and others didn't touch on, serious subjects and things, but it was more pop. It was more inspirational. It was more, we're going to maybe tread lightly along the struggles that people have, and we're going to focus more on God and those things. And then you listen to some of the things that Scott Hunter is singing about and some of the struggles. This was very, and I haven't struggled with depression or anything like that in my life. I've been fortunate that way, but like knowing that there were real problems out there,
Hmm.
and that a lot of people uh, face those kinds of things and other issues, to see Christian music that was diving into that for some reason that appealed to me because I've always been
Yeah.
a generally upbeat kind of person, but there was something about this that drew me. Uh, his vulnerability and his willingness to have this almost. I was thinking about this the other night, and it's never occurred to me in all these years, which is kind of bizarre to me because now that I see it, it's so clear to me. When Scott Hunter is singing, there is something that is vaguely reminiscent of Billy Corgan
Hmm.
in the sense that while he can do the rasp, he can do the growls, he can do that. There's this very breathy, almost not feminine, but there is something that is very not alternative about the
Hmm.
vocal quality and his ability to go from one end of the register to the other
Hmm.
in those different ways. It's not unlike, for me, it's not unlike the lead singer of Silver Sun Pickups.
Hmm.
When I first heard one of their albums, I was not expecting what I heard.
Yeah.
So having this, there was something about that that also stuck out to me. And the Sprinkle Brothers, I mean, come on. Jesse's just having like the time of his life on the drum kit and just smacking away. That's one thing that I've always loved for like there's this like I tend to like things kind of structured
Hmm.
and I tend to just sort of there's a part of me that goes like that. But I think when it comes to creativity and musical pursuits, stuff that's a little bit left of center or where you can tell they're sort of drawing outside the lines for me
Hmm.
is is appealing. I listen to, that's one of the things too is listening to Sin. This album still holds up 30 years later. This is still some wildly inventive music that they were making, and
Yeah.
so there's just there's just so much
Yeah.
that I love about this album.
Yeah. I love when you talk about Scott Hunter and his lyrics. I love how they are that darker side that felt very unique to me getting into Christian music. I also really like how poetic they are. Like he really is trying to it feels like he is trying to write something that is unique and not just easy lyrically. And I think I was reading some stuff and like there are I think even times where he's like, yeah, that just sounded cool. You could take it a couple different ways, but I like the way it sounded, and I like that. I like lyrics to be specific as well, but I like how he was kind of willing to just be honest about it and be like, yeah, there was something just poetic about how this turn of phrase sounded, and so I liked it, and that was out there. So you're right, his voice is he can snarl, he can growl, he can swoon, and he can emote. Like he can get so much out of his vocal range and out of the way he produces it. There's so much comes through that is really interesting to think about it because you just see such variety. That's the word I use over and over when I think about this album in particular. But his vocal delivery is just I think really unique. So
I would say one more point that I would add in that favor is I can still remember when they had their sort of album release slash reunion show back in 2001 or whatever it was
hmm,
for the waiting room. Some friends of mine and I went up to see them, and on a side note, the opening band was Seven Head Division, and their bass player was someone that I had gone to a youth group with in high
hmm,
school. So that was fun to see that. And when that first show, or when Coral Blue was doing their opener, whichever song it was. I want to say it was Revolve.
hmm,
I know this isn't related to this record, but just this idea that when it's loud, it's getting kind of groovy, they're doing their thing, and then all of a sudden Scott comes in with those vocals, and my friend he turns to me, he's like, I was not expecting that
yeah,
because he expected something heavier, louder, darker, whatever it was, and I think that's even all these years later, that memory sticks with me because that was one of the things that drew me to this band and to Scott's performance specifically.
yeah. And not to go on and on about what we love about this, but like even musically, you talked about Jesse's having so much fun back there. Like it is even the musically, it's so diverse. I mean, I think about a song like Cannon Fire Orange. Doesn't it should not work. It absolutely should not work. and yet it is perfect. Like every time that song comes on in this, when I'm listening, I'm like, oh, that's perfect. Ring True is just kind of thrown in there, and that one does sound different because Aaron's on the lead vocals, and like it's just so diverse, yet it fits perfect. It's unbelievable to me. And I will say it. I've said it on a couple times when I've talked about Poor Lou albums. Nick and Jesse are perfection. They are just the perfect rhythm section. They work together so well. I don't know what it is, but they just never miss, in my opinion. And you talk about rhythm sections, I think often get overlooked in bands, maybe less so now, but they are perfect and they work together so well. It's like making me emotional thinking about how well they work together.
Have you ever noticed this sort of like kissing cousins quality with Bliss Is for this album versus Tried and True from Mind Size?
I haven't.
Just the way they're, like you said, the rhythm section, the way it's sort of loping and it's going from here to there, and they're doing all these different little things. But there is for me, listening to those two, it's kind of like talking about Boom for POD and Lights Out. They're in that same vein, but obviously they're distinct, they're their own thing. But those two sort of they're paired, in my mind, they're paired together because of their qualities, what the rhythm section is doing, what Jesse's doing when he's playing drums and everything. So that's another thing that sticks to me because there was so much. It seemed like they had a free reign to kind of do whatever they wanted instead of, well, we're just gonna be super slick and polish this thing and make it sound like pop radio for 3 minutes and 15 seconds and then call it good.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think there's a lot more we could say on that. My last thought is I love how the second half of the album is better than the first half, but that's controversial, so we won't even go into that. But there's a lot more we could probably say, but we're a little short on time, so let's move on to our next question here. Why is this album important to you? And I know we've touched on a little aspects. And why do you think this album holds up so well?
I think part of the reason, and like you said, we've touched on some aspects of this, but I think part of why this one is so important to me is that this is, maybe on a personal note, when I think back to my high school years and even into college, when I think about the music that I was into, this is one of the linchpins for me. And I'm thinking about bands that were my favorite bands that helped define sort of that era of my life musically. I'm thinking of Poor Lou and DC Talk and Newsboys to some extent, just because for some reason they always seem to be touring through our small little town. I never really understood that, but there it goes. But also then you're thinking of like Oasis and Joe Satriani and BT and Foo Fighters. Like these are like those, when I think of like my favorite bands of all time, especially from that era, those are the names that are coming up. And I think they were the most interesting Christian band to me.
Yeah.
Because back in that period of my life, I was really, really heavy into the Christian music, and I still am to some extent. But I was, part of the schooling environment that I was in, and other things. There was sort of this move of, oh, you got to get rid of all your secular stuff and really push to the Christian thing. And I did that to some extent for a little while. And I think they were one of the bands that I really latched onto because they had a sound that I could identify with. They had lyrics that I couldn't always relate to directly in terms of like my own life history, but there was something about their artistry that spoke to me, like I mentioned before.
Yeah.
And I think on a much lesser level, it was also interesting just that they were on the West Coast. I mean, growing up, and this is something that even into my freelance days was still, a problem for me whenever I was trying to do assignments, was I could never interview half the bands that I wanted to because they could never come west of the Mississippi, let alone all the way out to the West Coast. Just too expensive. So when you got a band that you are borderline obsessed with, and they actually happen to be in your time zone, you actually see them a handful of times, especially within the Christian community. And this is also never having gone to one of the, like Spirit West Coast or anything. Like I never went to one of those,
Mm,
massive events. I mean, they had a couple of like theme parks that I went to; those were great, but never one of those like 3-day events like out in Monterey or whatever.
yeah.
But that was huge. There was something accessible about that that went beyond just what you were listening to when
Yeah.
you had your CD on at home. And I think part of the reason it still holds up for me all these years later is that it just sin is raw and it's honest and it's creative and it's for me it was my window into Polo Blue. And obviously their discography goes in a bunch of different directions. For
Yep.
anyone who's has experience with it, they know this. But that was my window into that was my doorway into Polo Blue.
That's a really good point. This is also my entry point to them. I've gone back since and I have all their old stuff and all their new stuff since. But yes, this was my entry point. And I think this was a bit of a breakout for them. So this was kind of the bigger, I want to say hit, but I don't think it was ever really a hit. But yeah, I think part of the reason this holds up is because I've talked about 1994, partially because I started a podcast in the middle of 2024. So I'm talking about a lot of albums celebrating a 30-year anniversary. 1994 for alternative rock is as good as it gets. There's maybe a better year, but I mean, it's amazing. And I would put this album up against anything from 1994. Christian, secular, blow your budget out of the water, tiny budget in indie thing. This stands up against any of it. And yep, maybe I'm biased because of my personal history with it, but I think if you honestly went into a listen of it without any like preconceived notion, I just don't see it too many people walking away from going, well, that was trash. I mean, to me, it's just such an interesting listen. So I think it holds up against any of those. And I think you're right. You nailed it. It is one of those first Christian albums that really blew my mind. That, I had been listening to the Newsboys, Steve Taylor. I was starting to edge into that alternative stuff. And then we stumbled onto this and the Prayer Chain, I think, were the two big alternative acts that we stumbled on. And we were like, our minds were blown that it was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe how good this is. So I think you nailed it. I think for a lot of the same reasons, this is why this album just holds up and is so important to me. So you mentioned seeing them live. How many times have you actually been able to see them live? Sorry, this is not on the script, so random question you got to think about.
Well, I know, okay, there was the show in Washington. I went to at least, we had I don't know what it's called nowadays, but there was a Paramount's Great America, whatever that version is today. They would have like twice a year, they would have some kind of Christian music festival. And I know they were at least one of those. And there was another one, I don't know if you're familiar with, there was a record label called 5 Minute Walk.
Oh yeah. I mean, my favorite band's Five Iron Frenzy. So yeah.
There you go. Dime Store Prophets, stuff like that. They actually headlined a 5 Minute Walk show. I want to say my senior year. So over the years, I would have seen them at least 3, and I want to say maybe 4 or 5 times.
Okay, nice. I only got to see them twice. Once was in the Twin Cities. I'm from Minnesota. They came through. We had a little tiny Christian music club. So I saw them once there. And then I think I saw them at Cornerstone. I think they were at Cornerstone in 2002 after they released The Waiting Room. So I think I saw them then as well. I think that those are the only 2 times I saw them live.
And it's funny. Just one little thing, if I can say, at the one time, that one of the times I saw them at a theme park, I remember they're all, because you're sort of in one of their little side areas, and there's rides over here and different things going on, and they're doing the show. And then I remember at one point, I don't know if it was the middle of a song or after a song, Scott's talking to us, and he's lovingly like critiquing them like on their mosh. He's like, okay, remember, we're just basically the short version is, okay, we're pogoing. Okay, we're not trying to fight and crash into each other, just up and down, not side to side. Don't want anybody getting injured. I always thought that was amusing.
It's funny to think about injuring at a Poro Lou concert because they always strike me as a little funny because the Sprinkle Brothers, neither of those guys are over 6 foot. And then I think both Nick and Scott are like football sized men. So I've always thought the image of them on stage is pretty funny because Scott and Nick, I think, are both got to be 6'3", 6'4", And then
Yeah,
both the Sprinkle Brothers are so tiny. It's a funny collection, even when you look at the pictures in their jackets of them standing there.
I was gonna say their press photos are great.
Exactly. And some of them are so nice. Like some of the stuff off of Sin, it's so perfectly mid '90s. I love it. I can't not love it. So
Oh yeah, absolutely.
we've talked about a number of songs. We've kind of been talking about what we love about this album, but what are some songs that we haven't mentioned, or just songs that you're kind of like your go-to songs? And I know it's hard not to say all of them. I know that is that's tricky, but what are some of your favorites from this album that you feel like are just the standouts above the rest? And I will say, I don't think there's a bad song on this album. There's a couple okay ones. There's a couple fillers, but in general, I would say there's not a bad song on here. But what are some of your favorites?
I think we've touched on it a little bit, but I would be remiss if I didn't follow up just a little bit more. Ring True
Hmm.
was the CD version of me playing a song on a tape and just until it got warped.
Hmm.
That was the one. And then, God help my brother once Straight Six came out and I just played For the Love of My Country all the time, all the time, all the time. He hated
Sure.
that song. But before that one came out, it was Ring True. And I played that one. That was like my favorite. And it's not like it's funny considering some of the other things we've said about this album. It's not the most adventurous of the
Hmm.
album, of the songs. It is a bit more straightforward, and love that Aaron's doing the singing there. And there was just something about that one, and just the the way the rhythm section goes on that one, and just the way it's presented. There was just something about it that
Yeah.
has always stuck with me. And Complain is obviously a big one, just because, hey, that's the opener. That's what got me into them. I'm just kind of surprised we haven't touched on Where Were All of You.
We would have gotten there.
And we would have gotten there. I feel like that's the one. And oddly, that one didn't jump out to me
Hmm.
at first when I was really getting into them. It was fine, but it took me a little bit of time to really, really get into that, and especially the outro, which goes
Yeah.
along with. I was listening through the album the other night, and I had forgotten just how many acoustic interludes
Hmm.
or outros there are for this album, and just how well they juxtapose with the rawness of the album. I mean, you have sort of this notion within a lot of alternative and rock music. Oh, you got to have at least one kind of ballad in there to slow things down and get
Yeah.
the AC radio, and also maybe to give your the band members a few minutes of to sort of catch their breath during a live show. But there are a number of instances where Aaron really shines playing
Hmm.
acoustic guitar or something that is just more down tempo and just something
Yeah.
that's more simple that way. Bliss is, like I hinted or like touched on earlier, that's a banger.
Yeah.
It sort of it reminds me like their progression from Mind Size to Sin, and how they had grown in some ways and evolved musically. And but yes, to go back to your original, yes, I'll cheat and say there's not a bad one on the list here, but those are some of the ones that stand out for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Where Were All of You is my favorite Poor Old Lou song. I that is still the standout track. There's a couple things on Wait in the Waiting Room that are, I think, pretty amazing as well. But well, on every album they've got something that's amazing at some point. But Where Were All of You, I think, is still probably I see it as kind of the quintessential Poor Old Lou song. So maybe that's more of what I see it than it's my favorite, because I think it's a great way to introduce them to people. It has a lot of the elements that they really, really do well. In some ways, it also feels like a little safer song than some of the other ones. Maybe I'm not characterizing that well. I think you use that song or that phrase really well for Ring True, and I think Where Were All of You could be that. But I think it's just that one's so good, and that's one that I think the lyrics have aged really, really well. I read them in the last kind of 4 years. I was like really trying to take a deeper dive on the lyrics, and those I remember the lyrics really standing out. So those are worth. A song that's worth going back and kind of looking through the lyrics. I just think they've aged really really well. And I mentioned Can of Fire Orange. I love that song. I know it's a little silly, but it's so good. Bones Are Breaking is another great song because it's so kind of feels like almost hardcore, but not, but still like contained. And there's so many really quality things on the album.
Oh, absolutely. And if I not pushing back, but let's back up to Cannon Fire Orange for a second. I don't know that you can really say, or well, okay, you could say it, but I don't know why you would jump to it being a silly song, considering, I mean, you know, these guys at the end of their albums, they have little recordings of, what does the cat say? Meow, like the old toy from like the 80s when you were 5. And then they got another one where it's, people going to, an ice cream truck. And then there's, can't forget about the necklace.
I think it's the Mexican flair of it that it maybe silly isn't the right word. It's just, it feels out of place. And I'm always just like, it feel, again, I said it before, it feels out of place, but yet perfect. Cause I mean, that was the song on a first listen. That was the song that jumped out to me and my friends, I think. And then it was kind of like, cause I think it was just so different that it felt really alternative. And then, it's the song that jumped out, but then we've grown to love, the entire album. So I think I love Cannon Fire Orange as a point of just what you can do and how creative you can be and how interesting you can make an album. So yeah, my only complaint about any song is I think Sickly is not as strong of a closer as some of their other albums, because they, especially on Picture of the Eighth Wonder and Waiting Room, the closing tracks are mind-blowing in my opinion. And Sickly's good. It's a really, really, really good song. It's just in comparison to some of their other closers, it's like, oh, it's just not quite as epic as some of their other closers. So that was the other thought I had.
And I was literally just gonna say how much I like Sickly as an ender.
Oh, okay.
Not necessarily, not as a way of saying like, oh, okay, in comparison to these other ones, but I think just because there is almost, we talked a little bit about the diversity of the album and how there is this vaguely bluesy sensibility to the guitar and to the way that it is presented and the way, Scott's singing through some of these lyrics, are you stupid? And just,
right.
There's like this, there's just this vibe about the whole thing that it's within their range. And as you come to know them, it's within what Paul Lee does. Like there's very Paul Lee-esque about it, but it's also, especially within this album and its own context, there is a lot of variety. It adds to this theme of variety that we've talked about.
Yeah.
Yes. When you want to talk about epic closers, I mean, Closing Down at the time, we kind of thought that was it. So that was like the most really titled final song in the history of ever. But then also for, the Waiting Room there's definitely some more fireworks going off with that one than you get with Sickly. I think Sickly, there's still something appropriate to me about how they ended. It's not necessarily, it's not like it's meant to end on a depressing note or something, but it's not like we're going to go out with a flourish and this upbeat music and whatever. It's just it's more like introspective, just kind of, we're going to ease our way out here and just see ourselves out.
Yeah.
I've always appreciated something like that.
I like it a ton. It's just, I always want to talk about closing tracks. So that's, but I do. I mean, it made my list of favorite songs. So, and there's a couple I omitted, but it's still in there. That's how much I like it. So. Sailing away towards uncertainties change the day. Travel to the land to get all sick in hand. I fought for cover, then I ran. Found the love, colored me whole. No more cannon fire orange, cannon fire orange, cannon fire orange. Someone's never heard this album. They're hearing us talk about it. Somehow they've gotten connected to this podcast. If you're going to sell somebody on this album, hey, 30 years later, this album's worth checking out. I know we've touched on a lot of things, but what are you going to kind of use as a selling point to go get somebody to to go check this album out. Or if there's just stuff that we've covered too fast and you wanted to mention in other parts, this is also a good wrap up. Anything else we've missed covering?
Well, for my folks who are into Christian music, Christian radio, and things, I would say, well, if you want to hear something that's not Third Day Radio or Mac Powell Radio,
yeah,
have I got something for you? And I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but not entirely, because for a long time that was my joke about Christian radio. That's what it was. If it didn't have Mac Powell, or if it wasn't like Rebecca St. James, then they weren't interested, because seemingly he had to guest on every single song and he had to play at least two or three, or the occasional, okay, well, maybe we'll get Mercy Me in there too after a while. That was sort of like Third Day Light. So it was like, basically this has become the Mac Powell experience.
Yeah.
But I think with this album, I think what I would say is that if you want Christian music that is raw and really makes you think and shows you not the darker side, but acknowledges the fact that everything is not hunky-dory within the faith walk all the time, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And there are ways of explaining that, especially nowadays, because back then I think of, maybe it's just product of the sort of general social environment that I was in, but it was very much, hey, you're Christian, happy-go-lucky, everything's great. Let's not talk about our problems, vote Republican, yay, Jesus. But then I think as time goes by and you sort of realize that, yeah, even within that community, there are people who struggle with faith. They struggle with doubt. They struggle with self-worth. They struggle with all these things and more that Scott Hunter talks about in the lyrics sometimes. And so I think for today's listener, especially younger kids, teens, people who are more likely to be disaffected, giving them something to latch onto that says, hey, you know what? There are other people of faith who are having who have had some of these issues. They've walked in some of the same shoes as you all. If you want to listen to something that might resonate with you, then this is something worth trying. And then obviously, like, whether you grew up with it or whether it's like a retro thing now for kids, obviously alternative rock and roll, it's like, this is one of the best things I ever heard. My own bias aside, just from a quality standpoint and the way they go about their delivery of the music and the singing and the just everything. There is a lot to like here, and it stands up. This is what I was listening to when I was a kid. This isn't just, oh, not in my backyard, or hey, when I was a kid. This is music that I thought should have been on mainstream radio then, or at least alternative underground radio, and I would still think that today.
Yeah.
Because the songs are of that quality that they very well could have been. I'm not sure, frankly, why they didn't get that in the first place.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. It's so authentic. It's them doing their music. It doesn't feel like it's forced or manufactured. Like, it doesn't feel like a copycat. Like, there's no way around it, whether people like to admit it or not. There's a lot of Christian copycat bands. This is not that. These are guys out there making authentic, genuine art, touching on those subjects that you talked about. I think you nailed it. That is a reason to go back and check this album out, and it's a reason this album rules. So I think that is a pretty solid sales pitch to go out on. So yeah.
I maybe need to work a little bit on the actual sales pitch part. My longtime friend Aaron Minari is listening to this right now. He's probably laughing his ass off because, it's been a joke for like most of my life. If there's a way to answer a question in 5 words, I'll do it in 50. I just can't help myself, even when I'm really trying. Like, Aaron, if you're listening, I am really trying. But you know how much I like Coral Blue. You know how much I like this band. You know how much I like this album. So this is the best you're going to
get. That's me as well. I'm the person that my wife occasionally just stands next to me and just gives me the old side poke that they've heard enough from you. You can stop talking now. It's like I'm totally that person. I over communicate in every situation. It's probably why I do podcasts now. It's an opportunity to over communicate.
Oh yeah, and if my wife's listening, she's probably nodding her head too, because I have tried over the years. I really, I'm still a work in progress. I really do. I'm trying to be better about it. I think I am. I don't know how much, but I am trying to be better about it because I recognize it.
I'm off the rails probably. Again, doing podcasts is probably made me worse. I have noticed I try hard not to repeat myself. Like if I say it once, I don't need to say it slightly different another way. Just stop. But
Yes.
I'm still failing probably pretty miserably.
Just as a random thought, I think my mind would have absolutely exploded if somehow Poor Old Lou, Grandma Train, and Welcome Race Fans era Dakota Motor Company had done a show together.
Hmm. That's kind of the wheelhouse of amazing. That'd be the lineup of your dreams for a show.
It's just and I'm trying to remember. This is one of those times where you can't remember if you actually remembered this or if you've just sort of implanted this within your own mind. But I know I was looking through reviews in a magazine once,
Yeah.
saw some really odd combination where Chasing Furies opened up for like, I don't know, Out of the Gray or something that just didn't seem like they must have been label mates because otherwise it made zero sense.
Right.
Want to say in that same one, I saw a double bill of Dakota Motor Company and Graham Train. I was like, you gotta be kidding me. I would have loved that. That would have been fantastic, or at least in my head. Maybe, I mean, you see him live, maybe it wouldn't have been, but like
Yeah.
the idea, it just sounded so perfect. If you could throw Poor Lou in there on top of it, forget about it.
Yeah. I think if I'm going for my Christian alternative dream set, I think I'm going Black Eyed Siva model engine, Poor Old Blue, and the Prayer Chain. I think those would be my three, and I'd have Poor Old Blue probably closing. Although Black Eyed Siva was never as popular as Poor Old Blue, so that's why
Right.
they probably have to open the show. Unfortunately, even though they're probably my favorite of the three.
So thankful for all everything. All these words ring true to me. My strength is dead. I hope instead in what will be, in what we'll see. My strength is dead. I hope instead on every
I think that's a pretty good wrap up of this album. Again, I believe October 30th, 1994. I could be wrong. Full disclosure, maybe somebody from the Poor Old Losers Facebook group will tell me I'm foolish for picking this day, but somebody did say they sent me a picture saying that it was originally released on October 30th. It was in some promotional thing that they had seen somewhere, so I'm going with it. October 30th, 1994. Behind these curtains, we're actually recording this in August, so that's fun. This won't come out for a while, but I'll get it edited and get it out. So, Brian, I know you. I really appreciate the time you've taken to hang out and talk, and I know you got to jump. But where can people find you online if they want to follow you or get to know you a little bit more?
Yeah, I don't have a ton of presence online these days. I am on Twitter sometimes. Brian underscore letter C underscore Palmer, not terribly original. And I'm occasionally on Instagram, but I mostly just lurk and look at my wife's fun posts of our kids and different things. But that it's largely Twitter.
Yep. No, that's perfect. That's where we connected. So go follow Brian on Twitter. And yeah, thanks so much for joining me, Brian. I can't say thanks enough. I'm super excited to do that. I was super excited to do the show. Usually my notes are kind of small and mine were like getting out of hand. I was typing away and I was like, I need less of these. This is too much to say. But so clearly I was excited to talk about this album too. So.
Well, yeah, thanks again for having me. I've had an absolute blast. Like I said, I love this album. I love this band. I've had so much fun talking about it. This has been an absolute pleasure. So thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brian.
Take care.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Album Anniversary Podcast. Once again, I want to say thanks to Brian. Me and him have been trying to get together on a show for a while, and I was super excited to have him on the show to talk about this album. Great to have him. Let us know what you thought. What did we get right? What did we get wrong? What are your favorites from this album? You can find me on Twitter at Caleb the Spy, no spaces. I'm also on Instagram at Caleb the Spy with underscores underneath that, or in between the words. I'm really good. You can email me at calebthespypodcast@gmail.com. No spaces or underscores in that. If there are albums that should be on my calendar because they're worth celebrating, let me know. I'll try and get them added. I've run behind on some of these things, but I'm doing my best. If you want to join the show to talk about an album, the best way to do that is to just follow me on Twitter. I will post about the album an album that's coming up that I want to talk about that I don't have a guest for. So if that's something you're interested in, follow me on Twitter. I'll try and post ahead of time and say, hey, I'm looking for somebody to talk about this album. Some people have reached out to me with albums they're interested in doing. I try and do my best to keep track of it. I am just going to say it now. I apologize if I mess that up. I probably need a better system. But if you want to be on the show, follow me on Twitter. I'll try and throw out albums that I'm hoping to do shows on. Please subscribe and share the podcast. If you're inclined, please leave a rating or a review. I have heard it is an effective way to spread the word about podcasts. Most of all, I do want to say thanks if you engage with me at all on social media. It's always a joy to see people talking about albums that I post about, or having conversations, or discovering albums that they haven't listened to in a while, or discovering something that's entirely new. So it's always a joy to see people's responses when they call out why they love an album. If you enjoy this show, you might also enjoy the other show I do with my friend Scott. It's called I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. And it's not just a podcast where we reminisce about our youth, but we interview fellow 90s youth group kids and some 2000s. We're trying to just kind of find out where they're at now and kind of how that youth group experience has impacted their lives, whether they're at the church they were raised at or they left the faith entirely. We just want to hear how that youth group experience impacted their lives. The music at the beginning and the end of this show is the instrumental version of the song Sing It Out at Street Level by Peg and the Rejected. Thanks again, and we will talk to you soon. Hi, I'm your host, Caleb, or Caleb the Spy on Twitter and Instagram, and every day on those social media sites I post about what I call album anniversaries. And look, it's just the release date of the albums. 3, 2, 1. Hi, I'm your host, Caleb, or Caleb the Spy on Twitter and Instagram, and on those social media sites, 3, 2, 1.